Hey everyone. I guess episode 2 of the SolarWinds Breach. I'm not going to go through any news or speculate or rumors or anything like that. I'm just going to be going over the NSA document. They've taken the time to write a document that covers a lot of things they've noticed from the SolarWinds breach and things you should pay attention to. If they took the time to write it, you should take the time to read it. But if not, I did just make an overview of it and with some visual animation, so that helps you understand what this attack looks like, what you need to be aware of, and then from there, there's some mitigation strategies as well. But on top of that, Alex Weinert, the director of identity security, he's been in the company forever, and he wrote 4 principles of protecting your M365 environment for on-premise compromise. And you know, be sure to look at that as well. He highlighted some key points that I think you should be aware of, or start planning in your or implementing in your security strategy, or building a roadmap for it. So yeah, these principles are going to be very helpful to help you achieve a better security posture and protect your cloud resources if your on-premise environment was to be compromised, right? So be sure to look at these 4 principles, and let's get started. Hey guys, I wanted to give you guys a general understanding on, the authentication methods. If you're already familiar with it, go in the description and just click on the timestamp to just skip through this. But if you don't know about it, then this will give you a little recap on these authentication methods and just a general understanding. So to make it more simpler, I'm just going to talk about scenario 1 where a bodyguard has an authorized list. And let's just say we have a security guard and he has a list, right? He needs to authenticate a user. Uh, he goes and Bob comes in. He says, "I am Bob," and the password is 123. He checks this list. You're good to go, right? Perfect. That's a general scenario. What if the manager has a list? Okay. If the manager has a list, well, what do you have to do? If that same employee comes in and says, "Hey, I'm Bob, password is 123, but the manager doesn't have the list, what does he have to do? He probably has to call, check with his boss, verify their credentials, or the code or whatever it is, and then she'll say, "Yeah, this person looks good, let him in." Okay? So you kind of understand generally these 2 different flows. It'll help you kind of relate with what the authentication methods are. And what that is going to be, we have method 1, password hash sync. This is when Azure AD will have a copy of the user list and passwords. So it's like the bodyguard has a list of the usernames and passwords, okay? So the master list still is retained by Active Directory, your on-premise AD. And then you use AD Connect to sync your usernames and passwords to Azure AD. Do we retain the actual username and passwords? No. We don't store it. We basically maintain a hash of a hash. We use an algorithm to calculate a hash, and then we hash it again, so we don't actually have the original password. So even if Azure AD was breached or compromised, we wouldn't know what that password is. All right? So let's say the username, Bob, and passwords provided is sent to Azure AD, and Azure AD will convert that password to a hash of a hash and see if it matches. Okay? And then he grants access. Now, there's single sign-on, there's tokens, and there's there's more stuff or more things behind this authentication flow, but at least you just get a general understanding of this flow. A password hash sync just syncs the hash of the passwords and the usernames to Azure AD so that it can verify. Here's another advantage. Because we have a hash of a hash and we have a copy of the password, we can provide reliability, meaning that if your Active Directory was to go down and your just data center were to go down, we can still authenticate. We can still provide services because we still have the list of usernames and passwords, right? We don't actually have to talk back to you. AD Connect is just syncing those information upstream. Okay? So if a bad guy was to do something in this environment, let's go do some scenarios. He could possibly, if he was to compromise this area, right, and he was to get in somehow this way, would he be able to take those credentials and then go into your cloud environment? Yes. But a different case, if he was to compromise this area and he gets this list, this hash of a hash, would he be able to use it? No, because it's a hash of a hash. It's not the actual password. It's just a hash of the password. All right. Does that make sense? So you don't have to worry about your passwords being compromised. And here's another thing. Because we have a hash of a hash, we can actually check in the dark net or the dark web and we can just compare it, in the dark web to see if anybody is in the dark web or, and is selling your credentials. So we can take the username and password and see if it matches anywhere in the dark web and then notify you that, hey, these credentials have been compromised. We're noticing them on the dark web. That user needs to change the password. Okay. So method number 2. This is pass-through authentication. This is when on-premise Active Directory maintains a list of users and passwords, and we are passing through, the authentication is passing through Azure AD, right? So we have to have an authentication agent, and that authentication agent is just going to basically be the agent that will be used to help Azure AD talk to your Active Directory environment. So the username comes in, the password comes in, and it passes through Azure AD, and it goes to the request that's made to this authentication agent and says, hey, is this username and password good, right? It's similar to that scenario where the bodyguard is phoning the manager and saying, is this person good? It's the same scenario, right? Let's talk about use cases though, or things that could happen. So if your environment was to go down, would everything go down? Yes, right? Because we don't have the list of passwords. So you can't be upset at us if we are trying to authenticate and your Active Directory is down. We don't have anything. You didn't sync it with us. What you can do is you can have a hybrid method where you can say pass-through authentication with password hash sync. If my pass-through authentication fails, I can flip over to password hash sync and still maintain availability for my end users, right? So you can kind of mix things together, but if you are only requiring, you only have this method deployed, then, you wouldn't be able to leverage, us checking credentials on the dark web or high availability and redundancy. You wouldn't be able to achieve that if this is the only method you're doing. Does that make sense? So the authentication is validated and access is granted. Okay. So this is pass-through authentication. We're passing the authentication down to Active Directory, but you have it within Azure AD as sort of the trusted relationship between us and your on-premise environment. And that allows us to provide single sign-on and all these modern authentications because we have this trusted relationship. Okay. So an adversary, if he was trying to attack, he can come through here, but really he wouldn't be able to access any credentials because it's not stored in the cloud. But if he accesses it here on your on-premise environment and he gets those credentials, then he can then just make movements back into the cloud, right? Or if one of these credentials has a global admin that has access to the cloud or more resources, so many different ways that adversary would try to compromise credentials, but those credentials aren't stored in the cloud, so we wouldn't be the method it would be used to be compromised. It would have to be something where you might have a server that's not updated, or maybe it's not hardened right, or you're not checking something. So this is still going to be your low-hanging fruit, is always trying to make sure your organization is protected, right? So we're talking about federation. So method 3 is federation. Federation is a trusted domain. It's like trusting someone else to provide that authentication. So in this case, we're trusting the federation with the on-premise federation server. And that server is going to provide that sort of trust between us between us and the your on-premise environment. Now that that trust relationship's provided, it's kind of like the pass-through authentication, but it's a little bit different. Here's why. When we request access to that cloud resource, we will do something called like a home realm discovery to discover if you're an ADFS tenant, and then if it is, we will reroute you or redirect you to your ADFS server to log in. Once you log in, access is granted, SAML token provided, and it also provides the authorization of what you have access to. And then from there, the user requests access to the cloud resource and sign SAML tokens, and he gets access, right? So in this case, you can kind of see that everything is centralized around that federation server. So if this federation server is compromised, you can have access to everything, because we don't maintain the list, right? Again, you can also do a hybrid scenario where you can have federation with password hash sync, but if you only are using the federation method, then you better harden that server, better make sure it's tight, and you're monitoring any kind of monitoring the activity on that server, and certificates being signed, and what's happening on that server. All right. So let's talk about the TTPs. The first TTP, TTP number one, actually had two different methods or two different things they wanted to talk about, and then we'll go to the TTP2. So the first one was, they noticed that the adversary or bad actor was forging trusted authentication tokens. So what that looks like is the bad actor compromised an on-premise server and stole private keys used to sign those SAML tokens, and then he made his own trusted tokens to access those cloud resources. So first, the bad actor gains access to on-premise infrastructure. It could be whatever method. It could be just an email, whatever, but he found a way to access your on-premise environment and was making lateral movements, found your federation server, and then he found that server, forged his own authentication tokens, and then from there, he used that signed SAML token that he created on your federation server, right, to authenticate. Access is granted to those cloud resources because we have a trusted relationship with that federation server. But it's been compromised, and the adversary got the private keys, and he built his own tokens, so he's authenticating with Microsoft. It's not, this all is flowing correctly, but the only thing that was compromised was that federation server in this case, right? So, you've got to make sure you're monitoring those certificates, or you're moving those certificates to some other storage repository, so it's not, those private certs aren't there. So another situation was add bad federation trust relationship. So another use case was the adversary. Basically, he said, "Oh, I wasn't able to get the get a signed SAML token for some reason. It was protected. It was hardened, and that he wasn't able to access those private certs." Okay, well, he'll try other methods, right? He's not going to stop there. He's going to now try to find some global admin privileges and just add some federation trust relationships himself. So that'll look like this. Again, find some way to gain access to your on-premise infrastructure, try to move laterally and find some on-premise server, try to find some global admin credentials somehow, and if he can, and he can find that admin credentials on the server he's logged into or harvested has the necessary cloud privileges or global admin, he then is going to create his own what we call a bad actor or federation server. He's going to be basically making his own trusted certificate. Okay, and then there he's going to generate his own trust certificate and he's going to forge his own SAML tokens. He's going to add that malicious certificate to the federation trust relationship on Azure AD and build his own trust relationship. So now there's two trusted relationships. Okay. Now that there's a trust relationship here, he can sign his own SAML tokens. And because he's signing his own SAML tokens, he can specify what he wants access to, which is probably just everything. Okay? Does this make sense? So this is a little bit different from the other scenario. The other scenario is he did it on your server. This scenario is he just built his own federation server and he generated his own certificate. He put that certificate on your Azure AD as another trusted federation that Azure AD can trust, and then he just signs his own tokens. So TTTP number 2 talks about, let's say there was no federation, right? Let's say that you don't have ADFS or federation, but the adversary was able to obtain a global admin. Okay, so some way he was able to obtain a global admin account on premise. Maybe he moved laterally, or maybe he copied your Active Directory database or found some way to harvest credentials, but he was able to obtain global admin on this on your tenant. And then from there, he uses that global admin to create an SPN, a service principal name. A service principal name is used a lot for applications, so that you don't actually have to have an application login to your, to access any cloud resources. It has its own authentication with its own certificate or its own secret to gain access to your cloud resources. So let's say the adversary builds his own little web app. Maybe he wants to set up some automation and build a botnet or whatever, but he doesn't want to actually log in. It also, because he builds an SPN, you might not be auditing your SPNs. You might be looking at users and their activity and passwords and email forwarding rules. But if he built an SPN or an application ID, then he doesn't actually have to go through this flow, and you might not be monitoring it or looking at it, right? And if you're not, he's going to use that app to make a request using the SPN to access those cloud resources. And then you get access, right? So it's just another method the adversary might try to accomplish. And in this case, it's not actually the Active Directory or that was compromised. It was more of the credentials, these SPN or application credentials that was compromised, and you may not be aware of it or monitoring those apps and what it should have access to. You should be proactively monitoring it, noticing, certain apps getting access to more resources than it should, and also, validating and just routinely checking, should this app still have these credentials, right? So if you're not, that's something you'll probably also need to pay attention to. So now that you're aware of sort of these methods, let's go over the mitigation strategies on what the NSA recommends. So there are going to be a number of recommendations. I will include links in the description so that you can go visit those guidance. We actually have a few Microsoft recommendations that were posted by multiple groups within Microsoft that you can review. The NSA also has their own links that I'll post as well. I'll give you links to the document, but I'm just going to go over some general items I've just noted so that you can be aware of. So you want to make sure to detect authentication abuse. You want to harden those authentication server and services, and you got to examine those logs. You got to examine if what's being created, what service principal names are being created, what applications are being created, what application SPNs have access to what resources, has new resources or access been given to an SPN that is outside of what the permission levels are. Is there new credentials being added for a user that allows access to an app without even signing in? Basically building an application with a client secret and without even having to log in, and the user made it and it accessed these resources, right? You got to be aware of all that because that's something the adversary will try to leverage. So you need a lot of visibility around these tokens, these apps being created, and SPNs, right? You also need to be aware that of a trust relationship being built. This is similar to the Adversary, building their own federation server and building that trust relationship from your Azure AD to a federation server that he built. He uploaded that token and then he starts forging his own SAML tokens and getting access to your cloud resources, right? You want to limit that. Another way I suggest is all the global admins you have, for your users on premises. If you have any users that are on premise that have access to have global admin, you know, to your cloud resources, you want to kind of remove that, and you only want to allow cloud only users to access these cloud only resources. And these users that are on premises, they don't have the ability to access those cloud resources administratively. And what happens is if that environment was compromised and the adversary was to compromise an admin credential on your federation server or your Active Directory, he still has difficulty accessing your cloud resources in the cloud. How do and so you basically have sort of these global admins that are set to access the cloud resources and make these changes and make these modifications. But the users on premise wouldn't have access to do that. They would have access to some stuff administratively, but not that global admin credentials. Does that make sense? You need to harden those authentication server and services and follow the NSA guidance. Again, the link will be in the description. And lock down those endpoints, harden those endpoints, patch them, and make sure the software is also updated. Because a vulnerable software, could be an entry point as well. And the moment that the software is compromised, they get access to the machine, then they're going to try to move laterally, right? So it could be any software. So always make sure your software is up to date and patched up, and also have detections in place so that you can see them moving and you can see them. You can mitigate that impact because you've already noticed that lateral movement, and he didn't really do much damage because he was doing reconnaissance. The goal is you need to catch him doing that reconnaissance and lay out tripwires and honey admin accounts and canary tokens and things to try to alert you when someone is in your infrastructure that shouldn't be in there. Follow the best practices around MFA, SAML tokens, and hardening those systems. And again, follow the documentation. I gave you a general overview, but in the documentation, there's going to be a lot more information for you to really look into and determine if there's any possible areas that you need to work on improving in regards to your security posture. All right, guys, the 4 principles that you should do to secure your environment from an on-premise compromise. 4 things. First, fully isolate Microsoft 365 admin accounts. 2, manage device configurations from Microsoft 365. 3, on-premise accounts have no Microsoft 365 admin privileges. And 4, use Azure AD cloud authentication. Just real briefly, the links are in the description. You need to actually look in the documentation and actually go through the details. There's a lot of recommendations, and I'm not going to go through all this whole list. It does a really good job in telling you exactly what to do. But again, you want to originate these accounts, these M365 accounts in Azure AD. You need MFA. You need conditional access. You need to make sure that you can only manage or access these administrative accounts from a Azure managed workstation. Okay, that way no on-premise account would have access or administrative privileges to modify or do things to your cloud environment. Manage devices from M365. So another thing that is going to help you from a man-in-the-middle attack or MFA man-in-the-middle attack, like Evil Gen X or anything like that, I'll do another video about that. But imagine that you try to do MFA authentication. Sometimes an adversary can spoof as another site and then trigger MFA authentication. You think you're logging into Microsoft, but you're not. It triggers MFA authentication. They log in on behalf of you, and then they're not device joined or anything, but they log in as you, and then they send that MFA request to your phone. You think you're logging into your own site, but you're not. You approve MFA, and then so that routes to that approval gets routed, and then he gets that session token. But you the whole time have it on his website. That actually happens. So how do you secure against that? Well, his device that he's logging in from, if it was Intune managed or managed by the cloud, he doesn't meet the requirements. He doesn't meet the conditional access policy, so it doesn't even work. So something like that would be a use case, right? And again, I'll go in more details in another video about man-in-the-middle attack. I'll show you what it looks like. No on-premise account has elevated privileges to Microsoft 365. That means that no on-premise account should have access to Microsoft 365. If your on-premise environment is compromised, you don't want that adversary to access your cloud resources. You might actually have more resources in the cloud. So if you access your on-premise, it might not be much. So depending on how much you've shifted to the cloud and your SaaS apps. So if you compromise that, at least you've segregated it or add another layer of defense, right? And then use Azure AD Cloud Authentication. So eliminate dependency on your on-premise credentials. If you're comfortable enough with Azure AD and you're confident that we will secure your environment for you, then eliminate your pass-through authentication and your ADFS or federation, and then just let us be your sole identity provider and just manage the authentication for you. And then add some password lists, add some FIDO keys to your authentication or your Microsoft app authentication, and really harden that authentication. Really identify the user and device you're coming from. All right. Again, everybody. So the documentation and everything I talked about is really just an overview. You really need to dive into the documentation and determine if there are any areas that you don't have implemented yet in these recommendations, and if there's any areas that you need to improve in your overall security strategy to ensure that you don't become a victim of a similar type of attack to what we've seen right now. So the next topic I think I'm going to do is DGA, domain generation algorithm. It is wicked. It's interesting. So I've got some thoughts on how to mitigate against that, some approaches that you could probably implement. So please subscribe, please like the bell, lets you know that when I post, and yeah. I don't know when I'm going to post it, but we'll see. Thanks for watching. Stay safe. Happy holidays.